Hey, Guru Nation, welcome back to another episode. We try to cover all different topics of our lovely clinical research industry, ranging from tech vendors to sites to career seekers to CROs and sponsors. Today, we've got an interesting story. We've got actually very interesting. I don't think we've ever had a guest like you on before. So we have Dr. George McGrath. He is the CEO of Lexitas Pharma Services, which we're going to get into, and also at the same time, a practicing ophthalmologist, which I have a lot of respect for ophthalmology. This is an area of research that I admittedly know very little about. I tried to dabble in it with a PI. Unfortunately, he retired right when we were about to get a study, never worked out. But Dr. McGrath has a really interesting story about how he became a CEO of Lexitas, because prior to that, besides just private practice, you were principal investigator, right? I'm assuming, for studies.
Yeah, I was. So I've been a principal investigator on a number of studies in ophthalmology. But I also was working on the sponsor side. So I was working for a company called Hovione, which is a CDMO traditionally, but they were developing their own proprietary products, and so I was responsible with a group of people of taking their internal intellectual property and progressing it into the clinic. And so that's how I actually got acquainted with Lexitas.
So how did you go from, okay, so as a PI, were you doing like clinical trials for Lexitas as an investigator?
No, so I did so I did so my story is a little bit more nuanced than that. So I came out of training and I went to an equity analyst firm. So I was an equity analyst for a firm on Wall Street called Edison Investment Research. And from there, I jumped into the sponsor side because I was evaluating a product for Hovione at the time and doing some research on it, like equity research on it. And so that's how I got into the sponsor side. I've sort of done the PI work on the side whenever I've been interested in studies. So within my practice.
So as a private practice clinician, you do occasionally do research studies, but you primarily do your private practice. How did you have time to become an equity analyst?
Well, at this point, it's 1 day a week, so it's really curtailed. So it was so it's very much
So I would assume, Dan, as an ophthalmologist, which I believe he said he is, so you're the doctor, a medical doctor, and then you probably have a number of optometrists working under you, in which you're delegating a lot of your tasks to them. It's kind of like a PA and an MD and general practitioner kind of situation, I would assume. Does that sound about right, doctor?
Yeah, it is. It's the relationship between optometry and ophthalmology is interesting. So optometrists are very good at glasses, refractions, contact lenses, and primary eye care, and so they actually make great eye doctors. And while ophthalmologists are more surgical based, right? And so that's sort of where they play.
But an optometrist, correct me if I'm wrong here, an optometrist is not a medical doctor, though.
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. That's the difference, is that my training is medical school, followed by 4 years of ophthalmology residency, or 1 year of internship, 3 years of residency. Whereas an optometrist does 4 years of optometry school and doesn't do medical school. Yeah, so so it ends up being a pretty good. It's analogous to a physician extender, the relationship, and they do good research, right? So they in ophthalmology clinical trials, certainly for anterior segment trials like eye drops and things like that for dry eye and neurotrophic keratitis and some of the other things, and contact lens trials and different things like that. They're fantastic investigators. And then for other trials, they're fantastic sub-investigators, right? So kind of to your point, Chris, where they get delegated a lot of the activities of the trial under the ophthalmologist.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. McGrath, I'm still curious. So, you do the med school, you do the residency, you do private practice. When did you decide to become an equity analyst?
So I did a master's in economics from Hopkins while I was in really between kind of the end of residency before fellowship. And so when I did that, that's when I got introduced to the field and learned the trade. So that's how I got into that. So when I came out of fellowship, I pretty quickly was part-time, and then it's dwindled down more and more as I've progressed in the industry.
Mm-hmm. And how did the CEO position come about with Lexitas?
Yeah, so Lexitas was my service provider for about 6 years at Hovian. So we ran a number of trials with Lexitas when I was a sponsor side, and so we were doing work with a minocycline product for meibomian gland dysfunction and ocular rosacea, and then we were also doing an ivermectin project for these mites called Demodex that can get on your eyelids, and so worked with them for a while, and then it came time where Hovian, it was the end of the life cycle for those projects at Hovian, so they were looking to license them out and things like that, and so it was a natural time for me to make a move, and so the folks at Lexitas were nice enough to hire me as chief medical officer to start with, and then they promoted me about 6 months into CEO.
And this is a CRO. They're a niche ophthalmology CRO.
Mm-hmm. Lexitas is a niche ophthalmology only CRO. We're about 200 people based out of the Raleigh-Durham area, and we run really global trials in ophthalmology. Anything from retina, like a lot of what we do is diabetic eye disease, age-related macular degeneration, cataract surgery is a big thing we do, dry eye, contact lenses, things like that. So,
and I'm always surprised. Again, I have like the least amount of experience probably of all therapeutic areas in ophthalmology from my career, and probably Chris as well. There's always seems to be a lot of studies in ophthalmology, and they're rather lucrative actually compared to most therapeutic indications. And I guess that could lead into a broader discussion of why is that the case, and how does ophthalmology kind of maybe forecast growth for the rest of the clinical research industry, or does it?
So it's a good point, right? So you're exactly right. It is a bigger market than you would expect, right? So I think the best I can tell, it's somewhere between 1.5 and $2 billion outsourced CRO services market in ophthalmology. So I think it's rather big considering it's a niche area. And certainly, to your point, the cost per patient in ophthalmology, according to some of the industry research, is higher than most. So it is more expensive to develop in ophthalmology than it is in others. And really, whether or not it's a bellwether for the market overall is really an interesting question, right? And I think I honestly think that I think that ophthalmology likely is indicative as a leading indicator for which way the market's going, because it can be lucrative for sponsors, but it also is one of the first things to decrease when the markets go down, right? So in the current market that we're in, I think what you're seeing is sort of back to the basics for a lot of the biotechs, a lot of the VC community, a lot of the investment community, later stage. And I think that what that means to me is that it's doubling down on oncology, it's doubling down on, diabetes, other types of indications which are much larger, and more in the wheelhouse of large pharma companies, right? And so, and then on the counter side of that, what you've seen is the withdrawal of some big pharma companies from ophthalmology. You saw Novartis kind of exit ophthalmology a few months ago, and others have similarly sort of cut back on ophthalmology. So I think that whenever the market is turning south, the overall industry focuses on the core basics of oncology, diabetes, hypertension, other things like that. And when the market is expanding, they start to look into areas like ophthalmology, where you might get an outsized return, but it's a little bit off of the beaten path.
I see. So you think, like, to compare it to, like, let's say stocks, since you're an equity analyst, would it be like ophthalmology is like a growth sector, and then maybe the diabetes, obesity, they're like the industrials, like the stocks that give dividends rather than huge gains?
I think that's exactly right, with the one caveat that the GLP-1 that was done has just like
Game
blown the
changer.
roof off.
We've got a
That's
few
been huge.
studies in
Yeah.
my site here in Arizona, Yuma Clinical Trials. I work with a doctor that loves obesity. He specializes in
Yeah.
diabetes and obesity, and he's obsessed now with getting these kind of trials. So it's keeping us
Mhm.
busy. Chris is
That's
negotiating
awesome.
one right now. He says the budget looks decent, I think.
Mhm.
I haven't looked at it.
Yeah. I'll tell you that it's how the specialty equipment that's required in ophthalmology is probably what makes it tough for doctors who aren't truly in the area to jump in, right? And it's not just a slit lamp and outfitting an ophthalmic exam lane. We've gotten really big on imaging in our studies, and
Right.
and that's and all of that is specialty imaging. It's not MRIs or anything like that. It's all,
I mean, imaging is
special
everything in ophthalmology. Like,
100%.
how does AI play a role in this? Do you think that, I mean, across any therapeutic area, you're going to have central assessments, right? Central readers, whether it's for X-rays or MRIs for osteoarthritis or Alzheimer's. You're starting to see EEGs and other wearables in major depressive disorder and CNS indications. Ophthalmology has always been about imaging. I mean, those are like the primary endpoints, right? Usually.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think certainly imaging has always been central up until the Apellis approval earlier this year. Companies had always had to fall back on a functional endpoint like vision or something like that. For Luxturna, for the gene therapy that was approved, it was a maze where the patients had to walk through without stumbling on blocks with the lights turned down low.
Wow.
And
That's
I know
brutal.
it is brutal. It's we've actually been, the University of Pennsylvania is doing some work on a virtual reality aspect of that, where you actually put on an Oculus headset and do that rather than actually in real life tripping over blocks, which I think is much more humane. So it's a good development that's coming out of UPenn that we're following and have worked with a little bit. But back to your question about AI and imaging, we because Apellis was approved on an imaging endpoint, which was the first time that's happened in ophthalmology, it's been a little bit game on for imaging as the primary endpoint for our trials. And so people are really doubling down on the imaging now. And to hit on the AI aspect of it, I think that there's two aspects to this, right? So imaging in ophthalmology is becoming higher resolution, more more precise. There's advances in the actual technology where people are using adaptive optics and things like that, and getting down to right now the OCT axial resolution is like 7 microns. So it's
Mm.
it's incredible the detail you can see. And then you've got the other aspect, which is the software side, where AI plays a part. And just like in any indication, the role of AI right now is to pick out patterns in the data that humans can't see, right? So that's really what we're doing with it right now. We're using it to basically feed in all of the pre-treatment images and then look at the images post-treatment and mark the patients who are a success and mark the ones who are a failure, and ask the computer if they can help pick out the patients at baseline that are most likely to have a favorable response. So at Lexitas, there's a lot of people doing a lot of great work on this, but at Lexitas, what we've done is basically phase 1 of the project, where we've trained the computer to look at images of an eye and tell whether or not the patient has diabetic macular edema, so a type of diabetes in the eye. And it can do that with literally a 99% specificity and a 96% sensitivity. So it's pretty accurate.
How accurate is a physician as accurate as AI?
Yeah, so for this it is. So this is a pretty simple thing. So physicians can look at it and you can tell honestly, it's pretty much 100%. It's pretty obvious. So that's phase 1 of the project that we've been working on. Phase 2 is to see if we can't extrapolate it, like I was talking about, to a trial where we say, okay, these are all diabetic macular edema patients. Okay, which ones respond, which ones don't? How do we tell? So that's honestly what we're working on right now.
Yeah, the algorithms are kind of that's a new thing I've noticed, Chris. We have a depression study, and they're using algorithms based on brain waves to drop people out. Like the algorithms are the final filter. After the humans run the IE criteria, the last thing is must pass the algorithm check of brain waves. And like you said, doctor, they're looking at the pattern. So we're seeing this across different therapeutic areas, but it seems like ophthalmology has been leading the way. As the CEO of a CRO, I mean, Chris and I have these discussions all the time with sites. And at what point, all the big CROs, all the 5-letter ones, 3-letter ones, they started out being enabling sponsors, right? They enabled sponsors to do more. They enabled sponsors to do trials and not have to worry about monitoring. And over the decades, that's evolved into more complex trials. And it's almost as if many of the CROs have an incentive to increase the complexity, not reduce it. As a CEO of a niche ophthalmology only CRO, do you see the role of the CRO changing? Like, it used to be just about monitoring. Now that's almost like an afterthought compared to all the tech you guys are rolling out.
Yeah. So I think that it's I think what the industry is changing to, at least in ophthalmology, is that our job has more from just being an extension of monitoring and an extension of project management to actually being the operators who figure out how to truly execute these trials. Because I think the pendulum swung a little bit too far in the complexity, because what we're preaching now is more of a simplicity, because enrollment rates went down, right? So as the complexity went up and as we had COVID and people lost staff and things like that, there's been a big across the board, not just ophthalmology, but everywhere. There have been problems with enrollment rates. And so we spend honestly a lot of our time right now thinking about how we improve enrollment rates, and that goes to a couple things, right? That number one is it goes to complexity of the trial, because it just becomes too difficult to do at some point. And the investigators just don't want to do it, right? They'll pick a different trial. It's easier. And then it comes to staffing at sites. And so making sure that the sites that that lost a lot of staff during the Great Resignation are actually getting those people back and then training them, right? So when they bring in their people, training them. And we've actually got some good case studies of that where we've had investigators who've come to us and said, "Hey, we're interested in research, but we've never done anything. It's kind of intimidating." And we send some of our people to sort of to the site to train their people, and they enroll and they have great data quality and things like that. So I think there's a shift in the industry towards getting trials done in a cost efficient, time efficient manner at this point that's a little bit different than just trying to ramp up the complexity and trying to ramp up the monitoring visits and things like that. So,
And at the same time, and I know Chris has been dying to ask the CEO of a CRO some questions, but at the same time, an interesting observation I have had and been having with tech vendors, especially the ones I respect, is there's been this shift from tech vendors to making products more site-centric. So, in the past, everything was patient-centric, and it sounds good, but it's very difficult to achieve. But site-centric is a little more achievable. However, it's very tough to build a business model on that because it requires user base and user growth and premium sort of growth. But I see the tech companies as slowly inching into CRO territory, at least territory that used to be CRO. I mean, CROs were supposed to be site-centric at some point, and then sometime along the timelines that shifted to where they're no longer site-centric. They'll never say it, but they're the ones, acquiring these vendors and then forcing them on the sites when the sites don't want them. What are your thoughts on this? Like, as a CEO of a CRO, do you view these tech companies as allies, or are you guys trying to innovate internally, or how do you see this?
So I would say that this is very prescient because I just literally had a call about this right before, like yesterday. So this is on top of my mind, and I'll tell you that example, and then I'll get into our sort of philosophy. That example is that we've got a new technology machine that is evaluating. It's the primary endpoint in one of our studies, and that's been rolled out by a small company that is a tech company, right? And they're basically a hardware company. And so the cool thing is to partner with them where they say, "Hey, we can provide the tech, right? We know how to do that. You guys know how to handle the sites, and you guys know how to roll this out and operationalize it. How can we work together to get this hardware into the sites and get it up and running without upsetting the sites, without causing undue stress." And so it was a fantastic conversation we had, and I think it's a great model. In general, at Lexitas, we're site-centric, right? So we are doing our best to protect the trials, protect the investigators, and we don't. We honestly will use tech when it's needed and wanted, but we are not trying to push anything out that the sites don't want. So if we're getting pushback from the sites, we basically that's what rules the day. Because I think, to your point, I think the first step from our side, the first step towards being patient-centric is to be site-centric, right? If we can make the sites functioning well and happy and enabling them, then they're the ones who are seeing the patients. So
Right.
I think that's our philosophy. So we deploy tech when needed, but we certainly don't. We only do it when it's needed by the sites.
I mean, so many things I can ask. What do you think about sponsors trying to squeeze in more and more exploratory endpoints at the cost of increasing study complexity? What is your role as a CRO as far as advising them to do that or not to do that in different situations?
Yeah, it's a balance, right? I mean, you want them to, and rightfully so. If these patients are giving up their time and are willing to enroll in the trial, you want to get as much data about the drug as you can. Um, but but I view our role as being we're the mediator, right? We're my job is to allow the scientist at the sponsor to decide the whole laundry list of what they'd like to have, and then I come back and I say, well, this, that, and the other is reasonable, and then X, Y, and Z is not reasonable to do. And we'll do it if they want to. And we've done things like separating visits into 2 days and stuff like that so that you can get all these exploratory endpoints done. But my job is to counsel them that the more they add, the harder it becomes on the patients, the harder it becomes on the sites, the lower the enrollment rates become. And then you honestly you worry about at some point when you add too many things, you wonder about whether or not you're sort of overloading the data from a quality perspective, right? If it becomes too complex, you end up getting a lot of deviations and stuff like that. So
Yeah, these phase
I'd like to,
2/3s or 1/2s are getting out of hand.
I'd like to
that's
ask
something we've seen a lot of is that's something we've seen a lot of is basically the 1/2, where it seems like a real trend in the industry is to do your dose escalation, then immediately go out into an expansion cohort. So
Yeah,
it's
in the same study and just flipping the
yes.
switch whenever you feel like it. I'm dealing with one of these right now. Chris, go ahead, man.
Well,
Just
I just want
venting.
to ask a follow-up question to that, and you probably already know the answer to this, Dan, because you do these every day, but I don't, and I would assume some of the audience doesn't know the answer to this as well. So, in terms of complexity, I would assume the push for more complex trials is a combination of both the FDA and the sponsor, but which is primarily responsible for the more complex trials? Is it the requirements of the FDA, or is it the sponsor being greedy in terms of data?
So I can speak for ophthalmology because I'm familiar with the ophthalmology department there, which I think it may or may not be a little bit unique. But from my perspective, the FDA ophthalmic division is quite clear and concise about what they want. They've done a great job of putting out some guidances, and they've done a great job of telling people exactly what the path is to prove efficacy. And they don't to get them to validate a new endpoint is quite a hurdle, right? It's done very recently by Apellis, but it has to have very, very clear rationale. So I think that most of the complexity increase that we see in clinical trials is secondary to sponsors trying to learn more and more about their drug, right? Just trying to understand their drug better, and it's a reasonable thing for them to be doing, and it's our job to sort of, at times just not to push back. That's not the right word, but at times to just alert them to what the real world consequences are of some of these evaluations.
So a dozen years ago, it used to be relatively simple to recruit patients for most studies, regardless of area. And now it's become very difficult in almost all areas of research. Now, what I hear you telling me is that sponsors are the main, I guess, problem in this area in terms of making stuff too complex to recruit patients, at least from the site level. So is that economically, is that beneficial to sponsors in terms of, yes, we're making this more difficult, but the data we're able to gather is helping us determine which studies or which new drugs, which IP really will probably be successful and which will not at an early point. I mean, what's the rationale behind the complexity if it's economically not beneficial? And again, maybe it is in terms of pursuing an IP. right? If you can't get patients, it's very costly for a study.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And the number of studies that, I was shocked. This obviously doesn't happen for us. We finish all the studies we start, but I was shocked to see a statistic about the number of studies that actually don't ever finish because they can't enroll. But to your question, so I don't think that my thought is a little bit more nuanced. I don't think that the sponsors are the primary reason why enrollment has gotten out of hand. I think the primary reason why enrollment has gotten tougher has been a lot around the macroeconomic and environment of everything that happened with COVID, right? So I think that what we saw were a lot of our key sites lost a lot of personnel, and so we had great PIs that were trying to train new study coordinators from scratch, and I think that really slowed everything down. On top of that, you had a backlog of patients that had to work through the system. So all the patients who didn't go get eye care during COVID, rightfully so, we're now getting back into the system. And so you had sites that had more patients, less staff, and I think that drove a lot of it. And you pile on the complexity issue that we were just talking about, and you've got like a recipe for a not great enrollment rate. So I think it's a little bit of all of those.
Well, add on top of that, now, not only are studies getting harder, not only are sites and CROs more short-staffed and more overworked than ever, maybe a bit of a recession here will change that a little bit, but there's still such a backlog. But on top of all of this, throw in the push for DE&I now. So studies now need to enroll minority patients as well. Where in the past, we couldn't get anyone. Forget about what their background was. Now, they want a certain percentage to fit or to check the DE&I boxes. So it makes it even like exponentially tougher. It's almost impossible to pull this off, all of these things simultaneously.
Yeah, and we've been lucky because we've always done a pretty good job with DE&I in ophthalmology, because we naturally have gone to nationwide sites that have had a good number of underrepresented people populations, and so that's something that we are very much more cognizant of for the reasons that you described. We now include that with the thought process, and in some cases have plans around that for larger trials to ensure that we get there. And so it does add another level of complexity. But luckily in ophthalmology, it hasn't really changed much of what we've done, because we've sort of naturally gotten a diverse group of people. So
how do you do that with the community-based sites?
We do mostly, community-based sites. So we do almost all private practices for ophthalmology, and then we've selected practices that are in different areas of the United States. So when we look at where the site distribution is, we make sure that there are both sites in the Carolinas, Minnesota, California, kind of spread out like that, all over the place. So it ends up being representative. I do think it's important. I think it's only fair to people that at the end of the day, the drug gets tested in all different people populations before it gets approved, so that we know. So it adds complexity, but I think it's an important thing.
What about decentralized clinical trials? Every 3 years, there seems to be a new buzz, and it's been DCT until Care Access fiasco. But yesterday, there was new FDA guidance on DCT. Do you think that works in ophthalmology, or that doesn't work for you guys?
It's a little tougher for us. There's one company out there that's doing a good job. It's called 2020 On Site. They have some buses that go around that are fully equipped, but but
They got
DC,
research on the bus also. Man, that's a bad
yeah.
a bad omen.
So it's they're doing a good job, and they're catering to a lot of ophthalmic exams for other indications. So that's a real niche, right? Is when you're working in a different therapeutic area. As we know, a lot of the immunotherapies and things like that have caused side effects with the eyes, and so getting those eye exams is a good service for some of those other trials.
That's actually a good
Core-
point. Like MABs and basically like this whole wave of immunotherapy and monoclonal antibodies. You do raise a good point. Like vision is one of the primary safety concerns for most of these new studies that we have. I mean, that's just going to keep these ophthalmology clinics busier.
Yeah, and it's hard because again, it's a whole, to our point earlier, it's a whole new level of complexity because the you're trying to run an oncology infusion trial, and then you try to add in ophthalmology on top of that, and just finding the site that's near, contracting with them, getting everything set up is a pain. And so 2020 On Site has a great offering for that, where they just literally pull the ophthalmic clinic up into the infusion center parking lot and they can get it done. So
And they're
it's pretty
nationwide.
cool.
These guys are nationwide.
Yeah, they are nationwide. Yeah.
We might need one for we don't do ophthalmology studies, but increasingly we need eye exams as one of our assessments. And if you think about it, Chris and everyone else listening, the vision changes, blurry vision, I mean, that's like 80% of all drugs have that listed on their labels, right? If you watch commercials, you don't even need to work in our industry. You'll listen to the side effects afterwards. You almost always hear something about vision.
Yeah, and if you, like everybody does now, they look at screens all day, phone screens, laptops.
That's huge.
That causes blurry vision too. So
yeah. So for us, for ophthalmic centric trials, DCT is tough. There are some, because it's so imaging based and because it's so the equipment is so nuanced, it becomes difficult to dissociate that from the site. So we there's some forays into that, but nothing that's been transformational yet. So
you guys still, you're a CRO that's, I imagine, constantly seeking sites, rescue sites, whatever you need to be. Are you finding a lack of qualified sites? Do you need research naive ophthalmologists doing studies?
Yeah, I think so. So I think what's happening with what's happening in ophthalmology is that the sheer volume of trials has gone up dramatically. And I don't think that the number of ophthalmologists conducting research has gone up commensurately with it. So I think what you have now is really a research base of PIs that have a lot on their plate. I mean, it's not uncommon for me to talk to some of our PIs and they have 15, 20 active protocols at a time, right, that they're enrolling. And so it's good for Lexitas because one of our core advantages why people come to us is because we work with them to make sure their protocols get to the top, right? We are really sensitive with our relationship with the investigators, so they do enroll our trials first, and we are very sensitive to the complexity of the trial and all the other aspects of it, so that it is at the top of that pile. And I think that that will only be alleviated when there are more sites out there that are doing research. And so I think that that is a real core thing to getting enrollment rates back to what they were in 2019.
Chris, do we have any ophthalmology sites in our network?
No, I don't think we do.
I almost had a PI here, but he retired and out here in Yuma, Arizona.
Just FYI, if you ever are looking for sites, I'm not sure. I would have to ask our coordinator of clients if we have any ophthalmologists. I would assume we do. I'm just not aware.
No, I appreciate that. We'll definitely reach out. We're always we try to cast a wide net for sure. So
Yep.
Yeah, especially if there could be DCT elements. Well, I mean, the ophthalmologist I had here did everything, had all the equipment. He was just old and retired. And then now we have an optometrist, and they have a lot of our sponsors. They have like safety eye exam assessments. They prefer ophthalmologists, but they'll accept an optometrist if they have the right equipment. So these guys do. They have like the optos and all that latest stuff.
Yeah.
So we've been here. They've just been so busy. We're like booked out until July to send our patients there. And it's May right now for those watching.
And I think it's completely reasonable for optometrists to do that. You know, I think that if it's just an eye exam, you know, the optometrists can be trained and are very skilled. So they're good. I think if you, to your point earlier in the podcast, if you get into more systemic, holistic medical doctor type things, then you need the ophthalmologist for sure.
Do you think that you're still a practicing physician, ophthalmologist? Do you think that's an advantage when it comes to site selection? Or like, do you get on the phone with doctors and have just doctor talk when they're your sites?
100%. Yeah. So I talk to the investigators all the time. I sort of know what the investigator is going to say because I've been in their shoes. So whenever I see a protocol or talk to a sponsor, I sort of have a good feeling for how the trial is going to enroll, how it's going to go, and it's pretty straightforward to validate that because, you know, I am a peer to them rather than.
So are you the medical monitor also? CEO and medical monitor?
I used to do that when we were smaller. I've gotten away from that as we've grown. So we've actually hired a number of other couple ophthalmologists and optometrists who handle most of that now. So,
would you guys ever? We have a large segment of our audience that are career seekers and a lot of IMGs, international medical graduates. And I've heard other CROs have hired IMGs, provided they have enough research experience to be medical monitors. Is that something you guys have thought about doing or have done?
Yeah, that's something we've done before, and it's in actually multiple different roles, both with medical monitoring and more of like a strategy consulting type role too. So it's something we're open to. You know, yeah. Absolutely.
That's cool. Especially now things are getting more global, like IQVIA's in most countries, most developed countries. And, you know, who's to say that their medical monitor, if it's a doctor in Mexico and it's a global study, why not have him be the medical monitor for US sites too? Like, it just makes sense.
100%. Yeah.
And just an FYI, Dan, I asked Julie, we have 2 ophthalmologists in our network.
There you go, Chris. Don't sell our services short. If you are a site looking for studies, we help you. Awesome. We help you negotiate your budgets. We put you in touch with people like Dr. McGrath. So yeah, if you need 2 new sites that are probably not in your network, doctor, let us know. We've got them.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Absolutely.
Chris, anything else that you'd love to ask?
No, the things that I was interested in were answered, and I appreciate it.
Sure.
I think niche CROs are going to become increasingly important if studies get more complex. And I think the bigger CROs that we all know by name are going to have to evolve into tech companies over the next decade.
And yeah, that's interesting. I fully see what you're saying with you know, I do think that we are uniquely positioned for like more complex ophthalmic trials. You know, that it's one thing for a big CRO to pull off a straightforward, you know, contact lens trial or something like that, but some of the more complex that really involve deep thought are probably better than niche CRO. And then the big CROs going to a tech company is a really interesting idea that I think you're probably onto something there too.
Yeah, I think so.
that tech's really a double-edged sword. I mean, for many trials, it makes at site level anyhow. For many trials, it makes things much more difficult opposed to easy.
Yeah, the bad ones that are forced on you, but the site-centric ones that I've played with, the sponsors of this podcast, might as well name them: Versatrial, CRO, and Inato for now. Those are site-centric, tech-ish type of companies. I mean, two of them consider themselves full-on tech companies, Versatrial and Inato, and then CRO's eSource, eReg. Those are all like site-focused. I use them every day. They make my life easier, but no one forced me to use those. Those are like, I voluntarily chose to use those. I think that's the difference. A lot of these CROs, they acquire these tech companies and then they kind of make them fit what they needed to do, not what the sites need.
So here's an example of tech that no site cares for: ePros.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
So, I mean, there's just tech, and there's very similar techs as well that just are not site centric, or do sites care to work with at all?
Right.
Yeah.
I think probably got
I agree
ePros
with
in
that.
every indication. You guys do ePros in ophthalmology?
We don't do ePros. No, we do pros, but not ePros.
So just
we
when the
keep
patient has a visit, you guys keep the questions limited to just
exactly
the day of visit. I think that's the best way to go about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. It's we've messed with ophthalmology's never we actually have some good patient report outcome questionnaires, but they've never taken off as sort of essential to trials. So there hadn't been that big of a push to get all that extra more complex data that ePros would purportedly get you.
I see. Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on, Doctor. I mean, love to connect with other people in the industry that are like-minded and niche. I mean, you guys are niche. We respect that. We do have 2 sites in our network that apparently do fit the bill for probably what you're looking for, and we could get those names out to you. But thank you so much for coming on. If people want to get a hold of you, where can they go?
Yeah, so lexitas.com is our website. LinkedIn is a good way. And then it's just my name, George.McGrath at lexitas.com. So it's we should be pretty easy to get a hold of, and we welcome any conversations. Yeah.
Do you have a LinkedIn profile for yourself, or?
Yeah, we have one for myself and certainly one for Lexitas.
Okay. I'll put Dr. McGrath's LinkedIn underneath this video. You guys go connect with him. Thank you so much for coming on.
Cool.
Chris, thank you for co-hosting and letting us know how much we hate ePros. Like, subscribe, comment, share, guys. Bye-bye.